Okay, part two.
Low oxygen.
Right. And which organ is more sensitive to the lack of oxygen? The brain. The brain.
Absolutely.
The brain's the most. It needs the most oxygen, right?
Yes.
And that's because it's doing millions of things simultaneously, right? Agreed?
Yes. I'm sure there's lots of reasons metabolically why it needs oxygen.
Right. I think a previous witness testified that it takes about 20% of the body's oxygen supply to function, right?
That sounds about right, yes.
But the heart also needs oxygen, right?
Yes.
So in terms of the professional standards for determining an asphyxia death, is it true that you have to first exclude all natural and non-natural cases or causes of death?
Well, you can have natural and non-natural causes of low oxygen. So I'm sorry, I guess I don't understand.
Sure. There's a criteria that's established for making a determination of positional asphyxia as a cause of death, right?
Well, I'm not really sure what, I'm sorry, I don't understand that.
Fair enough.
She doesn't want to answer.
Is the prone position in and of itself inherently dangerous?
Not if there are no other factors.
Okay. So the prone position is examined and used in a lot of different settings, right?
Correct.
I mean, even in hospitals, in the treatment of, say, COVID, the prone position is used.
Correct.
And in those circumstances, being in a prone position is not inherently dangerous, right?
Yes.
I mean, chiropractors put people in the prone position, right?
Yes.
She already answered it. Move on, dude.
Massage therapists put people in the prone position, right?
Yes.
So the prone position, I'm just talking generally
Right.
speaking, no other factors. The prone position in and of itself is not inherently dangerous, right?
Right.
Just like marijuana may not be that dangerous. But if you add fentanyl, methamphetamine, nicotine, caffeine, and all the other things, it can be an issue.
Is the prone position on concrete inherently dangerous?
Again, with no other factors, as long as someone can breathe, no.
Right. I could be laying by the pool in Florida, right?
Right.
On my stomach in the prone position,
Good
not
example.
inherently dangerous.
Right.
Of course, they're going to say, but there was other factors. There was cops kneeling on him, and his hands were behind his back. And he was, see, they're not even going to go that he's under the influence of drugs. I think that is a huge factor on why he was having problems, but they just don't want to admit that.
Do you know, or did you take into consideration Mr. Chauvin's weight in your analysis?
Oh, I'm aware of his weight. I would say I took it into some consideration, but it wasn't a major factor one way or the other.
Okay.
If he would have weighed
You reviewed
300
all
pounds,
the videos, right?
Yes.
And it's fair to say that portions of his weight were placed on Mr. Floyd's body at a different distribution.
Yes.
And ultimately, in terms of the autopsy that Dr. Baker conducted, in terms of the area in the shoulders, the back, and the neck, no bruising was found, right?
Right.
In your experience as a forensic pathologist, if someone is placing a significant amount of weight on a person's area for a prolonged period of time, would you expect to see bruising?
You might or might not. It's so variable.
And you would agree that there are no abrasions or bruising described in the autopsy in the neck area of Mr. Floyd?
Correct.
There's no bleeding into the muscles in his back, right?
Correct.
You would agree that the knee is sort of a pointy or a more protuberant part of the body?
I guess so.
I guess so. Well, it is. It's strong. It's. I mean, I would explain that as a defensive tactics instructor is when we hit somebody with a baton, we want areas where the skin is closest to the bone. And that's where the baton is most effective. If you hit fatty muscle tissue, it doesn't cause as much pain for the pain compliance than if you hit skin close to bone. And skin is closest to the bone in the knee and elbow, maybe ankle, feet area, face, jawline. That's the way I would probably try to get that in. But
Kind of flat on top because of the patella, but
see, she's kind of adding. She's always looking for a way to minimize his questions, and that loses credibility.
Right. And when we talk about the shin bone itself, there's not a lot in between the
Shin bone connected to the knee bone.
skin and the shin bone, right?
that is true. Yes.
And it's sort of a triangular shape, right?
Oh, I forgot the shin. That's another good place to hit.
And
your shin
again,
right with your foot.
along Mr. Floyd's back, there's no long bruise consistent with a shin bone, right?
Right,
And there's no more circular bruise consistent with a kneecap.
right.
You've reviewed, obviously, a lot of strangulation type cases in those in your career.
Yes.
Strangulation with the hands, right?
Primarily manual, but also ligature.
Ligature being like a rope or a phone cord or
Hanging.
something.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And in those manual strangulation cases, the pressure that's exerted in that will frequently leave bruises, fingerprint-sized bruises, right?
Frequently, but not always.
See, she had to qualify. She wants to.
And ultimately, what increases the likelihood of seeing a bruise is the amount of force that's applied, right?
You know, I don't know what all the factors are, whether it's fragility of the vessels, whether it's the length of time, whether it's the force, whether it's the location. I think there are lots of variables.
That was a good, honest answer.
So, yes.
And everyone bruises differently.
So yesterday depends on.
That's the point. The bruising differently. Women usually bruise easier than men. If somebody's got anemic or there's some sort of blood thing, they're going to bruise worse. So there's other factors that cause easy bruising, and there may be other factors where somebody doesn't bruise as easy. Maybe drugs. I don't know.
What medications they may take, right? So yesterday there was an analysis or an analogy to sitting on a church bench and you don't bruise your behind.
And that can feel long.
Would it be different if you're sitting on a church bench with a baseball, for example, underneath your butt?
I really couldn't say.
All right. So in terms of Dr. Baker's autopsy,
I thought that was a good example. Baseball's about the size of a knee. Good job.
you would agree that there is really no objective evidence showing any pressure to the back of Mr. Floyd.
There is nothing at the autopsy. That's correct.
Well, now I might have answered that. There's no objective evidence. Well, there's no objective evidence from the physical bruising, but there's objective evidence that I've seen the knee and the pressure on his back.
Did you find, or did Dr. Baker find hypoxic changes in his brain?
He died too quickly for that to show up.
But you said earlier this wasn't a quick death. He slowly slowed down.
That's when we talk about the lack of ischemic hypoxia, correct? Dr. Baker noted a lack of ischemic hypoxia.
I don't remember his exact words. You're describing lack of ischemic changes in the neurons?
Correct.
Yes.
In the brain.
Yes, because that has to happen over a period of time.
Okay. And when some...
What period of time? We talking seconds or minutes? Because you just said the period of time that he degraded wasn't an instantaneous death, and now you're saying he didn't show the signs of a non-instantaneous death.
Someone is experiencing that shortness of oxygen or that lack of oxygen to the brain, that will frequently lead to certain symptoms, right?
Yes.
Confusion is one.
That could be, yes.
Restlessness,
Could be, yes.
shortness of breath,
Could be.
visual changes,
Could be. Mhm.
incoherent speaking.
Could be.
So, to your knowledge, did Mr. Floyd, in the videos that you observed, ever complain of these any visual changes?
No.
did he appear to be confused to you?
So what time period are we talking about? Sorry.
Sure, that helps. Maybe if we narrow down the 9 minutes, during the 9 minutes that Mr. Floyd was restrained, did he appear confused to you?
Oh, gosh. How do you describe his behavior?
Well, I mean, did he was
I don't have to describe it. I'm asking the questions. How do you describe it? You watched the video.
articulating that he was in pain, right?
Yes, and then he couldn't breathe, and he calls for his mother, and he says he loves people. I mean, you might interpret that as confusion, or you might interpret it a different way.
Did he appear to be breathing during this time frame?
Not effectively.
Do you know?
Wow, man. She's losing credibility fast. The tougher the questions get, the more she kind of tries to manipulate her answers.
How many breaths per minute?
No.
If one expert indicated it was at a rate of 22 breaths per minute, would you disagree?
I would have no way of assessing that.
When someone is hypoxic, they start breathing faster, right?
That can be a mechanism of trying to balance.
At least for the first 5 minutes or so, Mr. Floyd was talking, right?
Well, again,
I mean, talking, yes or no? He was talking.
he was, yes, there were words, yes.
Finally. Even then she had to qualify. She's being non-responsive. She's trying to give a freaking out instead of just answering. He was talking, yes. Well, yeah, if you want to call it that, well, maybe if and buts and coconuts.
So he had an open airway.
Yes.
And you'd agree that, or would you agree that at some point he went limp?
Yes.
Right? And would you describe what you saw as the progression of hypoxia in that instance at the point he goes limp?
That is certainly a good explanation for it, yes.
Was not a sudden hypoxic event, right?
That is my interpretation, yes.
You would agree that if he was progressively growing hypoxic, you would expect whole body hypoxia? I'll rephrase my question.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm not a doctor, so I have to rely on my notes quite a bit. So if he was progressively suffering from whole body hypoxia, the brain would be the first thing that would show signs of hypoxia.
Oh, I see. Yes, yes, the brain is the most sensitive.
And you would agree that that would not occur in a matter of seconds, but it would take a matter of minutes, right?
Correct.
And asphyxia due to position or compression, that prevents air from getting into the lungs, right?
Yes.
And that leads to what we would call a global hypoxia.
We haven't really used that word global.
Whole body.
I mean, if there's inadequate oxygen, the blood flows everywhere. So I guess that's what you're talking about.
But the brain is the first thing to show symptoms of hypoxia.
Right, that's the most sensitive organ.
And in this particular case, where you have a 90% stenosis of the right coronary artery, that's going to be limiting oxygen to the heart, right?
Yes.
And he has a big heart, right?
Yes.
Needs more blood.
Yes.
And adrenaline speeds up the heart.
Yes.
Methamphetamine speeds up the heart.
It can, yes.
So methamphetamine and adrenaline cause the heart to work harder.
Yes.
And increases the heart's oxygen needs.
Yes.
And at what point does the stenosis in the left and right coronary arteries become critical and cause the heart to stop? Generally.
Oh. Are you asking that same question about?
See, another reason this is confusing a little bit and she looked kind of out of it is, remember, she probably met with the prosecutor 4 or 5 times and they went over her testimony. So she looks more reactive and more confident and it appeals to the jury more. Another side benefit where the government has all the cards stacked in their favor.
As a forensic pathologist, what degree of narrowing do we consider potentially fatal?
Right.
70, 75% and above.
Now, in terms of drug use, right, you obviously were aware, based on the toxicology, that Mr. Floyd had certain drugs in his system, right?
Yes.
And so when we say on board, that means in the system.
Yes.
Would you describe the use as you know, based on the information that you have, as sort of a binge use of drugs?
Oh, I guess I couldn't answer that.
Are you familiar with drug use taken or used rectally?
I've heard of that, yes.
And that increases or speeds up the distribution of controlled substances in a person?
It speeds up absorption, yes.
So the effects would be felt much faster.
Yes, they could.
In a case where you have
Again, he's going back to that hooping.
a person who is experiencing cardiac arrest, right? And they're put in an ambulance and taken to the hospital for resuscitation. There's IVs that are placed in a person, right?
Yes.
And those IVs contain saline,
Yes.
and saline can ultimately dilute or decrease to some degree the amount of controlled substances that would be as they would be measured.
That's a theoretical possibility.
You'd agree?
Oh, I would make that point. Because all the numbers they got are different because they put him on saline. And if those decrease the numbers and they took blood from the hospital after saline was introduced to his body, his actual amount of drugs on board was higher and it was diluted by the saline. That's a great point. I'm surprised he hasn't driven that home more specifically.
Agree that fentanyl is a respiratory depressant, right?
Yes.
It slows breathing and lowers oxygen in the blood.
Yes.
Does the fact that there's norfentanyl in his blood mean that he took it some time ago?
Yes, but by some time, that's a very vague, yeah.
So long enough in the past to start metabolizing.
Exactly.
But does it exclude him taking fentanyl more acutely or more recently in time?
No. There's no way really of knowing the timing.
Fentanyl depressing the respiratory system can also act with the coronary artery vessel, can interact with coronary vessel disease, correct?
Can you clarify that? I'm
Sure.
sorry.
Does fentanyl's depression of the respiratory system also act with coronary artery vessel disease and oxygen and carbon dioxide to reduce the supply of its supply to the heart?
Oh, so as fentanyl may lead to a gradual progression of slowing breathing and ultimately decrease the oxygen, that would apply to oxygen to the brain as well as to the heart. Is that what you're, yeah.
And it would likewise increase the carbon dioxide in the blood.
Yeah, I mean, anything that decreases respiration decreases that exchange.
So as that exchange process is happening, right, you're not taking in the oxygen, you're likewise not expelling the carbon dioxide, right?
Right.
And thus the carbon dioxide will increase because you're not expelling it, right?
Correct.
You would agree that methamphetamine is a stimulant, right?
Correct.
And that can cause a cardiac arrhythmia,
It can.
and it can increase a person's heart rate, right?
It can or cannot.
And you testified before.
I don't know why she says it can. I don't think I've ever heard of anybody taking meth and their heart beat and blood pressure hasn't gone up. I mean, I just, that's what meth does. It's a stimulant. It stimulates everything.
That methamphetamine, there's no safe level of methamphetamine, right?
Correct.
So the fact that methamphetamine is at a lower toxicological standard doesn't somehow make it safe.
Right.
It doesn't exclude the possibility that it could increase the heart rate.
It could or not.
In terms of the evidence in this case, were you made aware that drugs were found in the backseat of the squad car?
Yes.
And that those drugs contained the DNA of Mr. Floyd?
Yes.
And that those drugs were at least to some degree partially dissolved?
Yes.
and that those drugs were fentanyl, a mixture of fentanyl and methamphetamine.
Yes.
Based on the toxicology in this case, did you see any metabolic byproduct of methamphetamine?
No.
And so that means that the methamphetamine was taken more acutely or recently in time.
Probably. I mean, there's lots of variables.
So again, just kind of taking into consideration removing certain variables, right? You find a person at home, no struggle with the police, right? And the person doesn't have a heart problem, but you find fentanyl and methamphetamine in this person's system at the levels that they are at. Would you certify this as an overdose?
Again, in the absence of any of these other realities, yes, I could consider that to be an overdose.
And
Woo, man, that's a great answer and great question. So, had she not seen the video, she would have said, this is an overdose. Had she not seen the video and there weren't drugs, she would have said it was a heart attack. But because she saw the video, the heart attack and the drugs are no longer considered. Man, I just don't see how any reasonable person cannot see reasonable doubt that the knee killed him. I'm not saying Chauvin was right. He's a great guy. I'm not saying any of that. I hold government accountable. I think government should be held accountable. But government needs to be accountable also in his courtroom. And the prosecution is government. And they are throwing this trial because of color and not because it's just or right.
And the level of fentanyl in a person, again, in this hypothetical scenario, there are deaths certified as drug overdoses significantly lower than 11 nanograms per milliliter.
Lower, higher, it's got a huge range, yes.
The answer is
As low,
yes.
I believe as 3% or 3 nanograms per milliliter.
Yes.
Right. So the ingestion of drugs is unique to that individual's body, right?
Right.
Prosecution is going to come back and try to pull this tolerance crap, and he's been taking it for a long time. But you know what? Prosecution never does that when there's a hardcore alcoholic that's driving and he's 2-0. And I've pulled people over and they were like perfectly safe to drive, and somebody for some reason wanted to hook him, and I'm like, dude, I thought he passed the test pretty good, and he'll blow a 2.5 or 3.0, and we'll be like, what the hell? I couldn't walk if I was that. But that doesn't matter. It's the legal limit.
Dr. Thomas, a few
Oh, I guess he's finished. Okay, here's the redirect.
things I'd like to try to that if we take the police subdual, restraint, and neck compression out of this, what would you conclude Mr. Floyd's cause of death to be? Remember those questions?
Oh, yes.
Aren't those questions a lot like asking Mrs. Lincoln,
Yeah.
if we take John Wilkes Booth out of this, may I finish? It's
Oh my God. That's absolutely outrageous. He objected now, and now he's trying to say he's finished. I bet the judge doesn't let him finish.
analogy.
That's argumentative.
Dr. Thomas,
He's pissed at the judge because he didn't let him finish. So now he's going to rephrase it and get it out anyway. Let's say I rephrase. Maybe he'll throw in a hypothetical.
if we put the police subdual, compression, and neck compression into this, restraint and neck compression into this, what was the cause, the manner of death for Mr. George Floyd?
The cause of death was the law enforcement, subdual, restraint, and compression, and the manner of death is homicide.
Does it make any sense to you whatsoever from the standpoint of trying to assess cause and manner of death for Mr. Floyd to be answering questions having to do with hypothetically taking the facts of this case out relating to his subdual, restraint, and neck compression?
Man, that's freaking, I don't know what his objection was, but it sounds freaking argumentative, and he's leading a witness. Does it make any sense? That calls for a conclusion on her part on whether the defense has any sense or not.
You can finish the question.
Dr. Thomas, from your standpoint as a forensic pathologist,
You can tell he's upset and he's chewing at the bit. He's pissed off because this guy made a lot of good points and his points were valid. And now he's trying to like make him look like he's an idiot. This is where attorneys that are buddies outside the courtroom, now it's getting personal.
and your analysis of manner and cause of death, would you ever approach an assessment of manner and cause of death by taking out of it the facts that you found relevant and highly pertinent to assessing and determining the manner and cause of death?
No.
So then why did you take out the drugs, the lifestyle, the high blood pressure, the heart? Why did you take all those out and just say the cops did it?
And in this case, those factors are what?
The law enforcement subdual, restraint, and
Oh my God, he's going to get her to repeat that over and over and over again.
compression.
And you were asked questions again about fentanyl and meth. Remember those questions?
Yes.
I wouldn't let her say that answer again. I'd say ask and answer.
Do you know what quantity of meth was even involved or found in Mr. Floyd's bloodstream?
I have the number,
Well, let me ask you a
but
question.
it was very small. I mean, I do know that.
And so this was the point. You found it that was a very small amount.
Correct.
Were you able to assess based on the
I cannot believe that not one attorney or one witness has brought up the compounding and the complexity of poly drug use when you mix stimulants, depressants with the body's natural adrenaline and I mean, it's just freaking crazy that they have not got to that, because a small amount of meth is not the same as a small amount of meth with fentanyl. And a small amount of fentanyl is not the same as a small amount of fentanyl with meth, because they do things differently and they make things interact totally different. And nobody's brought that up. I can't believe it.
amount? What kind of effect, if at all, it would have on the stress or strain on his heart?
No.
It-
There's too much individual variability to correlate one number with one person's reaction.
Well, let's see with respect to fentanyl, if there's a punchline we can get to with respect to fentanyl. Fentanyl has been discussed with you, Dr. Thomas, as a respiratory either depressant or suppressant.
Yes.
In order for us to go from fentanyl to death, in the middle, there are certain symptoms and responses and reactions a person would have who's suffering from fentanyl overdose or intoxication.
Yes.
If the person doesn't have those symptoms, those indicators, then would you feel that it's possible even to conclude that they are suffering from fentanyl intoxication or overdose?
No. If there's no signs of fentanyl overdose, then it makes no sense to conclude that there was an overdose from fentanyl.
And to be clear for the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what are those symptoms of fentanyl overdose or intoxication?
So fentanyl is an opioid. It's like morphine or heroin, and it causes slowing. Well, first of all, it's a potent pain medication and given mostly for that, but it also can cause slowing of the respiratory rate in a very gradual, peaceful, non-struggle kind of way. What is described as people just fall asleep and may just kind of slump gradually over because they very peacefully stop breathing, or it slows and then eventually stops.
And they fall into a sleep out of which they can't even be aroused.
Correct.
Would that be also known as a coma?
Yes, ultimately it's a coma.
When George Floyd was on the ground for the 9 minutes and 29 seconds, was he asleep to the point of not being able to be aroused?
Not for the first half of it, no. And then afterwards, he was completely unresponsive, but that's a different.
For the second half, he was unresponsive with no pulse.
Exactly.
Objection. We don't know if he had a pulse because nobody took it till the ambulance showed up.
Was George Floyd, during the 9 minutes and 29 seconds, ever in a coma that you saw?
No.
So when we talk about fentanyl overdose,
How does she know he wasn't in a coma? How does she know he didn't go into a coma and then die? I can't believe she can answer that like that. No, he wasn't. I didn't inspect him. I didn't do the autopsy. I'm reading reports and watching videos, and I know for a fact that he was not in a coma. Wow.
did you ever see, as applied to George Floyd, during the 9 minutes and 29 seconds?
Okay.
Did you ever see, as relates to fentanyl overdose, during the 9 minutes and 29 seconds that he was on the ground and during the subdual and restraint by Mr. Chauvin, that he ever exhibited any of the symptoms of fentanyl intoxication?
No.
Well, why? If somebody takes a stimulant with a depressant and they're acting like they're on stimulants, why would you know they had an depressant on board? I wouldn't know that till I did a test on them, till I looked at their eyes, till I did a 30-second Romberg test. I would have to do tests to determine if they have polydrug use or multiple drugs on board. And sometimes people will take multiple stimulants, like George Floyd, hence nicotine, caffeine, and they'll take multiple depressants, marijuana, fentanyl. I mean, it's just crazy the way they're kind of roughing over this. Oh no, all the drugs are in an isolated tube. His heart, his high blood pressure is all in isolated. Everything is separate. The only thing that killed him is the knee. I just don't know how a reasonable person can't find reasonable doubt to that.
You asked, again, quite a few questions about the heart. And remember that discussion?
Yes.
I think it was to the fact the heart was slightly enlarged, high blood pressure, narrowing of the coronary arteries, dead heart muscle cells. Do you recall
Your Honor, is that a question?
all of that being discussed? In order for us to go from there being issues with damage to the heart to a death from damage to the heart, in the middle, do we have to have certain cardiac events that then lead to death?
Yes.
Would you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, if we're going to talk about heart conditions, what are those conditions in the middle that actually lead to death?
Well, what ultimately leads to death is an arrhythmia, an abnormal beating of the heart. And as I described, it's generally it's often called a sudden cardiac arrest because it's sudden and someone just drops over.
Now, to be clear, when we're talking about these various heart conditions and a sudden cardiac arrest, fatal arrhythmia, did you see any indication of all this discussion about heart conditions that Mr. Floyd ever suffered from a sudden fatal cardiac arrhythmia as the primary cause of death?
No.
Nope, nobody has ever even suggested that. The fact that they're defending this shows they want everybody to ignore the heart condition. The defense never said he had a heart attack. The defense is only saying, how can you exclude all the heart problems, all the medical issues, all the blood pressure, all the mixed drugs on board? And there was probably other drugs on board. You notice they were talking about they don't record drugs that are lower. So the other drugs on board that his body could have been processing would absolutely slow down the processing of the new drugs on board, but they didn't record the old drugs if they were too low. So we don't even know if these are the only drugs on board. The only one they found was that sub whatever, marijuana, methamphetamine, fentanyl, nicotine, and caffeine. Those are just the ones that were above the reporting level.
Was there any evidence that Mr. Floyd suffered from a heart attack?
No.
If you bring to mind...
Was there any evidence that his heart condition had nothing to do with his death? Was there any evidence that his drug use had nothing to do with his death? If they answer that yes, then they're really bold-faced liars and your pants are on fire.
What was found during the autopsy, was there any injury found to Mr. Floyd's heart whatsoever?
No.
So if we talk about, for example, dead heart muscle cells, any dead heart muscle cells seen on autopsy?
Not that Dr. Baker described and not that I saw, no.
In fact, his heart was so ordinary in terms of non-injury that it wasn't even photographed intact, was it?
Not intact, no. Dr. Baker took one photo that showed no scars and no acute injury.
It was enlarged and 75 to 90% blockage, and it was perfect? Really?
Now, you were asked about certain studies out of Canada.
Yes.
On the prone position.
Yes.
And now, and the findings out of Canada, supposedly with real police and real police setting.
Oh my God. You know he's going to capitalize on that because she threw that answer in and he got it stricken. So he wants her to say again that it's amazing that Canada can have all these and no deaths, and yet our mean police here are killing people with it. That's where he's going with that. See, when you can't prove your case, you appeal to the feelings and emotions.
Was no fatalities.
Yes.
Are you familiar with any such studies reaching that conclusion in the United States of America?
No.
What is so peculiar then about Canada that we're talking about Canadian studies here?
That's what I don't understand. I mean,
He opened the door for her to say, our police are using aggressive means and treating our citizens worse, which is why we're having deaths here. And Canada police are trained better and don't treat their citizens that bad, and that's why they don't have death. That's what he opened the door for her to say, and that's what he wants her to say. But she's not figuring it out.
yeah, I found that study and I just thought, I don't know how to interpret this because it's so contrary to the actual experience of forensic pathologists in the United States.
Now you ask,
I think he could follow up and say, well, could it be that they're trained different and they don't employ the same tactics we do? Could it be that Canadian police are held more accountable than our police? I think he could have elaborated on that a little better.
questions about whether the prone position is safe to lay on your stomach.
Yes.
Are you familiar with whether or not laying in the prone position automatically brings about a reduction in the oxygen reserves somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 24%?
I am not aware of that, but I would defer to a clinician.
Perhaps a pulmonologist?
That would be the best, yes.
I think you were, in fact, asked a question about laying by the pool on my stomach in Florida.
Yes.
George Floyd was not laying by the pool on his stomach in Florida, was he?
No.
That's why it was called a hypothetical. Actually, no, George Floyd wasn't laying by the pool. He was committing felonies, multiple felonies, eating drugs, and fighting with the police. If you want to know what he was doing. An attorney asked me that question. That's the answer he's going to get.
I know the answer to this, but I'll ask you. You asked a question about sitting on a church bench with a baseball under your butt. You've never done that.
No.
Now, you were asked questions about symptoms of damage to the brain
Yes.
and whether there was any evidence of damage to Mr. Floyd's
I would have loved for her to say, well, actually, I have done that. And watch the expression on his face. Like, oh, shit, now where do I go?
brain.
Yes.
Would you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury whether the fact that you observed an anoxic seizure in Mr. Floyd, was that evidence of damage to the brain?
So yes, what happens in the brain is when there's inadequate oxygen, it reacts by causing this anoxic reaction or seizure that we've described. If someone then goes on and essentially is brain dead, but their heart can be restarted and they're kept alive for, say, a day, and then they die, then you will see changes in the brain. But in a case like Mr. Floyd, where he died during this period of time and his heart was never able to be restarted, that is not enough time for the brain cells to show any kind of reaction that you could see at autopsy.
Wait a minute. You said the heart was never started. CPR is working the heart. It may have not started on its own, but it was pumping blood, and they were putting oxygen in, and the blood was oxygenated and circulating through the system because that's what CPR does. So I might explore that as the defense.
See.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. No further questions.
Any further?
Come on back. Ask her about laying on the beach just to piss him off.
Dr. Thomas, after the heart stops, if the heart stops, is it possible that the body will continue to breathe or respire?
Yes, I suppose it could in some circumstances.
And that continued respiration after the heart stops could be a matter of a minute or two, correct?
I suppose that could happen.
And you would agree that methamphetamine also further constricts the arteries, right?
It can do that.
And so that constriction, there's been a lot of discussion about the level of methamphetamine in the system, this low level as it's been described, right? You said there's no safe level, agreed?
Yes.
Would you, as a physician, prescribe methamphetamine to a person who has a 90% or a 75%?
She's going to say, well, nobody prescribes methamphetamine.
Conclusion to his or her heart.
Objection, Your Honor, beyond the scope and relevance.
You may answer it if you have an opinion in that regard.
Yeah, I don't have an opinion. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Well, of course you doesn't, because the prosecution just told you he didn't want you answering that. So now I don't have an opinion. Why would you not have an opinion? You're here giving opinions all freaking day, and now all of a sudden you don't have an opinion? Bias!
No further questions.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Thomas. You're excused. Members of the jury will take our lunch recess. We'll reconvene at 1:30.
All right, I guess we'll end that there.